Let's all give a round of applause for Justin Trudeau and his policies. Why? Because those policies have successfully driven away capital in an amount that is now definitively measurable, at least to some degree. Copper developer Solaris Resources, whom is valued at just under $700 million, has finalized plans to leave the country by the end of the year. The decision to leave follows the federal government blocking a $130 million investment from Zijin Mining, who was interested in Solaris's flagship project that is located over 6,000 kilometers away in Ecuador. Well done, Canada. Let's dive in. The story behind Solaris's departure begins back in January of 2024, with the announcement that Solaris had secured a $130 million investment from the Chinese-backed Zijin Mining. The investment was set to see Zijin invest in Solaris via private placement at $4.55 per common share, which at the time was a 14% premium to the most recent closing price. Zijin was to purchase 28.5 million shares, which would give them about a 15% interest in Solaris on a fully diluted basis. On top of that, Zijin would have the ability to nominate one individual to the board of directors and maintain participation rights to enable them to keep their proportionate interest in Solaris should further funds be raised. At the time of the announcement, Solaris CEO Daniel Earl stated that the company took tremendous pride in announcing the new strategic partnership with Zijin and looked forward to leveraging their deep technical expertise and financial capacity. The funds were expected to be used for the advancement and development of the Warintza Project in Ecuador. The project is estimated to contain 900 million tons at 0.5% copper equivalent in the measured and indicated category, and a further 1.4 billion tons at 0.4% copper equivalent in the inferred category. In other words, it's a massive project. There was, however, a catch to this investment. The funding required the approval from both the People's Republic of China as well as the federal Canadian government under the Investment Canada Act. That act, however, was at the time in the process of being amended. So what is the Investment Canada Act? Basically, it's legislation that allows the federal government to review foreign investments that are made into Canada, enabling the government to block individual investments under specific circumstances. As per the Government of Canada, the Act is designed to encourage investment, economic growth, and employment, only interceding when an investment is not of net benefit to Canada or would harm national security. The Act originally went into force in 1985, but has had several amendments in the time since. The most recent update began in December 2022 under Bill C-34, which was intended to modernize the legislation. One of the key changes was a filing requirement prior to the implementation of investments in prescribed business sectors, which as it relates to Solaris includes critical minerals, of which copper is one. Bill C-34 notably was introduced just weeks after the government plainly laid out its policy on foreign investments from state-owned enterprises within Canada's critical mineral sector. The bill, which received royal assent in March of 2024, basically was reinforcing the legislation as it relates to this policy, among other changes. The policy, meanwhile, basically states that critical minerals are essential to the sustainable economic success of Canada and its allies, especially as it relates to domestic industry and security. As a result, critical minerals are a strategic asset, and investments from foreign state-owned enterprises can be motivated by non-commercial reasons that go against Canada's interests. Therefore, the government needs the ability to block investment from such enterprises for national security reasons. More importantly, applications for acquisitions of control of a Canadian business involving critical minerals by a foreign state-owned enterprise will only be approved on an exceptional basis. In layman's terms, this spelled trouble for Solaris and their ability to get the investment across the finish line. The first sign of trouble for the investment closing came 2 weeks later, when Solaris referred to the financing but didn't suggest a closing timeline, instead opting to expand on where the money would be spent once it was in the door. The company kept investors satisfied with the lack of progress by suggesting that the funds would be used to fast-track the progress of Warintza. 2 months later, the company refused to mention the financing in a March 1st press release related to a cooperation agreement signed for the Warintza project. The company also failed to mention the funding in subsequent news releases until April 23rd, when Solaris simply said that they are continuing to work through the Canadian regulatory process to close the transaction. Then again, on May 7th, Solaris reiterated that the strategic investment announced in January intended to support an expansion of activities and continued consolidation of the surrounding district, suggesting that the investment was still proceeding. 3 weeks later, Solaris finally gave up the ghost and announced that they would be terminating the minority equity investment with Zijin, which was said to be voluntary in nature. After 4 months of Canadian regulatory review in an evolving environment, approval has not been obtained and the transaction no longer adequately reflects market value. In making the announcement, Solaris blamed the government for the company underperforming relative to peers, due to the overhang of Canadian regulatory uncertainty in an environment of heightened domestic political sensitivity, which was despite that in the prior bullet point, the company claimed the investment no longer made sense because the price of the equity had risen by 35% since the announcement. CEO Daniel Earl at the time stated this transaction represented a minority equity investment from a well-known and respected publicly listed foreign company where the proceeds were intended to be used for the growth of a Canadian-controlled company's principal asset in a foreign jurisdiction. That this transaction cannot be completed in a reasonable time frame signals that Canada's critical minerals policy is counterproductive in relation to foreign assets. The transaction can basically be summed up as this. Solaris thought that because the investment involved assets outside of Canada with the use of proceeds that would expand Canada's interest in critical minerals, the transaction would be approved. That theory proved to be wrong. Now, most investors believed that that was the end of Solaris's tangle with foreign investments and the federal government. Instead, the company apparently wanted to get even. And on September 9th, Solaris revealed the first steps of a plan to leave Canada altogether. The company had taken the first steps towards aligning the company and its management with stakeholders and regulators in Ecuador, and would be moving their head office to Quito, Ecuador, in advance of a greater transition to Ecuador. More importantly, they would be emigrating from Canada. This week, further details of that strategy were announced. Basically, Solaris is skipping town and flipping the bird to Canada in the process. As of January 1st, the company will have a new CEO and president, along with new board members in an effort to cut all connections to Canada. The new chief executive, Matthew Rawlinson, who most recently served as the head of copper business development for Glencore, is Switzerland-based. He, along with Ecuador-based Rodrigo Borja and Switzerland-based Hans Wick, will make up the 3 additions to Solaris's board. At the same time, current CEO Daniel Earl, along with Poonam Puri, Kevin Thompson, and Ron Walsh, all of whom are Canada-based, will exit the board and the company as of January 1st. Following this, Solaris will have no one in Canada who is employed or self-employed in connection with them or their subsidiary operations. And also, no assets will exist in Canada, with no operations occurring in Canada at all. Solaris's chairman, Richard Warkey, commented on the departure by saying, "I am firmly committed to maximizing returns for shareholders and protecting the interests of stakeholders, and this reorganization creates the strategic flexibility and alignment of interests with regulators to do so." They've cut the cord entirely and are exiting the country, save for, of course, their TSX listing. All right, so let's wrap it up. Now, we obviously don't know if Zijin will return to Solaris once they've exited Canada. Based on the actions of Solaris, it wouldn't exactly be surprising if they did. It's a lot of work to emigrate a company, and you don't typically do something like that without a reason. Sure, there's spite, but also consider that the CEO will be leaving as part of the transition as well. As for the Investment Canada Act, Solaris aside, it's not technically terrible legislation. A country should be able to block investment from adversaries. Where things get hairy, though, is instances where a company may be domiciled in Canada, but its primary operations or assets are located outside of Canada, such as the case with Solaris. And it's not the first time that this act has caused problems similar to this. Just ask Lithium Chile or Ultra Lithium or Power Metals, whom in 2022 were forced to have Chinese firms divest their interests due to the change in policy. In 2 out of 3 of those cases, the primary asset wasn't even located in North America, let alone Canada. It's not like those are really Canada's critical minerals to control. And on top of that, the other issue here is the lack of reciprocal investment. If the Canadian government is blocking investment from China, one of the few countries actually supporting the mining industry, then maybe they should take a page out of China's book and actually encourage investment here. And maybe they can start with those Canadian pension funds that seem more interested in foreign assets than what's in their own backyard. I recently spoke with Frank Justra and we talked about this exact thing. He actually took on the case with Pierre Lassonde and wrote an editorial in the Toronto Star talking about how Canadian pension funds ignore Canadian mining investments, but are basically backing up the truck on investments in China. So the investment's allowed to go in one way, but not out the other. And the way that that's happening is certainly not in Canada's interests. I don't understand why we wouldn't want as much capital as possible coming into Canadian issuers. When I think about it, it's hard to understand any logic in it at all, other than to think perhaps Justin Trudeau is somehow compromised. But hey, what do I know? All right, everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Guys, also let us know in the comment section what you'd like us to cover, what stories you're watching, and what content you'd like to see more of. All right, everybody, I love you all.